Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Koshy, Director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture of the Modern Critical Theory lecture series on Marx and Marxism. I'm pleased that although we cannot see the members of the audience today, so many people are attending this talk and are joining us from many different parts of the country and from outside the US. So welcome to you all. Before I introduce our speaker for this lecture, I would like to quickly run through the format for the lecture. Professor Brennan will be presenting his talk in two segments of roughly 25 minutes with a Q&A session immediately following each segment. We will be running the discussion through the Q&A feature rather than the chat. So if you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A tab and enter in your questions there. You're welcome to enter your questions in at any time during the talk, but Professor Brennan will be responding to them at the end of each segment of his talk. I am delighted to introduce Timothy Brennan, who is the Samuel Russell Chair in the Humanities at the University of Minnesota. He needs little introduction since he has produced a bracing and wide-ranging body of work over the last decades, exploring the relationship between comparative literature, world literature, and global English in a range of venues. His essays and course offerings deal with the issues of intellectual history, cultural theory, the Marxist and phenomenological traditions, the avant-gardes, theories of colonialism and imperialism, problems of translation, and popular music. He is the author of numerous books, including Secular Devotion, Afro-Latin Music and Imperial Jazz, which came out in 2008, Wars of Position, The Cultural Politics of Left and Right, 2006, Empire in Different Colors, 2007, At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism Now, 1997, and Salman Rushdie and the Third World, Myths of the Nation, 1989. His most recent book, the first volume of Borrowed Light, titled Vico, Hegel, and the Colonies, was published in 2014, and the second volume, Imperial Form, is currently in progress. His much-awaited intellectual biography of Edward Said, titled Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, is due out next year in March. I'm now going to hand it over to Timothy Brennan, and a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you. It's really, really nice to be here, and I'm very honored that you would ask me to be a part of this. Okay, I'm assuming that most of you have read the study questions that I provided to guide us through the readings. And so much of what I'm going to say here at the beginning is going to be premised on that. I will leave the discussion of the details of those readings to the question and answer period. I suppose that on the basis of my study notes, you may already have a number of questions, even before beginning my lecture. And if so, wonderful. I look forward to discussing those details of the readings with you. But I do feel that this preparation in the form of those questions has made a point-by-point exegesis of the readings unnecessary in this lecture. Their meanings, though, are going to lie behind what I plan to say here, although seen from a broader perspective. As Susan said, I've split the lecture into two 25 to 30-minute sections, 25 probably, and then the questions will follow. So in the first half, I'm going to turn my attention to the methods of inquiry that distinguish Marxism from other schools of theory today. In the second half, I will discuss the dependency of today's theories of new materialism on Marxism itself, even as the new materialism seeks to displace it. When one speaks of Marxism, or as in the case here, is assigned the role of doing so, it's usually assumed that the speaker is a Marxist, by which it means that he or she is a partisan of a political outlook called Marxism. But I've never called myself a Marxist, and will leave it to others to assign labels. Are those who believe in natural selection Darwinian? Should those who grant the force of the libido and the unconscious be called Freudians? would one who concedes the truth value of general relativity be called Einsteinian? Similarly, Marx's overall analysis of capitalism, which might include a labor theory of value, the theory of the declining rate of profit, the idea that labor is alienated, that life in a market society is reified, that history is characterized by class conflict, and so on. These are hardly controversial propositions today for most educated readers. To be modern at all, in short, is to accept that, like Darwin, Freud, and Einstein, Marx offered an elegant and original perspective on modernity that is largely undeniable by editors at the Wall Street Journal every bit as much as by socialists, anarchists, and libertarians. I'm speaking of Marxism today in that light, not as a marginal or impetuous dissident, but as a student of history, and especially intellectual history. And I'm doing so in an American climate characterized by tendentious efforts to obscure this relationship and this status, and instead to promote, very often in the guise of dissidence itself, neoliberal values based on extreme individualism, intractable identities, a fear of political organization, and a deep pessimism towards the project of humanism. We have to begin by noticing then that in the context of this speaker series, we are operating at a certain disadvantage, and we experience a certain disproportion. Marxism is not, after all, just another school of literary or cultural theory to be placed alongside feminism, psychoanalysis, structuralism, deconstruction, biopolitics, and so on. We have to remember that apart from being a highly original and formative critique of capitalist society in the 19th century, it was largely responsible for prompting the creation of the discipline of sociology, which arose to combat Marx and Engels' own sociological discoveries, for transforming the study of political economy, and for launching dozens of competing schools of philosophy over a stretch of 170 years. It was moreover, from the start, a political force in its own right, spawning major parliamentary parties, revolutionary organizations, and independent states, many of them in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. By the early 1970s, we should recall, approximately 2/3 of the world's governments claimed to be socialist, and two major world powers, China and the Soviet Union, based their policies and social organizations on Marx's ideas. The world historical importance of Marxism, then, operates on a rather different scale than these other schools of thinking in the humanities, all of which are, to some degree, responding to, modifying, or reacting against Marxism itself. It is often the great unsaid, lingering in the background of these schools of thought as the major obstacle, rival, and point of departure. All of them, to a certain degree, define themselves in terms of Marxism, which they either revile, envy, or seek to outmaneuver. This is altogether obvious in biopolitics, for example, which is an attempt to bring elements of Marxism into the hostile orbit of certain ideas found first in Hannah Arendt and later in Michel Foucault. But it extends to older and more venerable institutions, like that of psychoanalysis as well, as the many allusions by Freud to Marx and Marxism attest. When we witness a new school of thought today that calls itself the new materialism, we need to recognize that only yesterday, the term materialist was simply a euphemism for Marxism itself. So there is an unmistakable allusion to Marxism in the name, which its authors understand to be the case, at the same time as they are suggesting that they seek to overturn Marxism or cancel it out. For their politics is hostile to Marxism along the following lines. They seek to assign to the term materialism the distinction that the public grants to the natural sciences for being objective and for directing its inquiry to the physical world of nature. Capitalism's technocratic structure has always accorded a special distinction to the applied sciences, and by the mid-19th century, an almost religious veneration has been given to the physical sciences, which has permeated the general culture. So it is not surprising that so many schools of thought in the humanities throughout the 20th century have sought to wear the mantle of the natural sciences, or mimic its procedures and methods, or metaphorically approximate its lexicons, which we see, for example, in the positivism of Herbert Spencer, in the simulations of mathematics in analytical philosophy, in logical positivism, in the structuralism of Levi-Strauss and later Althusser, and in a host of schools today, varying from the digital humanities through thing theory to speculative realism, animal studies, and deep ecology. The new materialism that I've been talking about fits very much within this wave. The new materialists claim to displace an older materialism, invariably by claiming that they stand for the new, which is an idea here I am undermining. And what is that materialism they are displacing? What the term really refers to as the Marxist intellectuals of the interwar period, and later in the 1980s and 1990s understood it, is this. It is the recognition that ideas, say the Vatic utterings of Foucault, Kristeva, or Derrida, do not simply issue forth from the genius of a master thinker, but have histories, that they arise in particular contexts, determined by specific agendas and interests, and that theories are, after all, the product of individual men and women with particular experiences, enmeshed in often very different material relations. They arise by force of will, stamped by place and time. When we struggle then, as all of you are doing this term in a speaker series like this, to make sense of the vast array of theoretical options and methodological approaches available to us in the humanities, we are forced to contend with the problem of the consensus, accepted fictions about the state of thought, the history of ideas, and the progress of philosophy that underlie the revolutionary proclamations of a break implicit in the phrase new materialism. For such an invocation of revolution, as Zizek in the reading that I had you do implies, has become altogether routine and is far too reminiscent of commercial advertising. But what he does not say, and what I am emphasizing, is that it is also an alluring technique for cutting off students and contemporary general readers from philosophical traditions and giving the theorist an alibi for not working through the past. Not everything the new materialism is after is ill-advised, far from it. Its advocates sincerely condemn the idealisms of the runaway social constructivism that dominated the humanities and the countless theories of discourse that proliferated in the 1980s and 90s, as anyone who was a teacher or student in those decades will remember. It is admirable then that the new materialists want to turn the discussion back to political economy, know that real social change cannot occur in thought alone, and they take discoveries in the physical sciences seriously. All of these positions are, from my point of view anyway, commendable. On the other hand, their very Franco-American blindness to the development of materialist thought within left Hegelianism, and their uncritical acceptance of the cover story regarding the triumph of deconstruction, phenomenology, and structuralist Marxism, drives them to misunderstand the current nature of dogmatism. I want to be clear on this point. The post-structuralist dominant, which reigns in the American Academy, is premised on a conscious foreclosure over 3 decades of the left Hegelian traditions, the very ones that I am, partly for that very reason, foregrounding in my readings. The post-structuralist challenge did not win the argument, as the new materialists tried to argue it did, so much as silence, or rather unsuccessfully tried to silence, the opposition. Various strands of the philosophical past, from the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu to the third world systems theories of Emmanuel Wallerstein and Samir Amin, to the left Hegelian philosophy of Georg Lukács and Ernst Bloch, were actively suppressed in favor of a largely Foucauldian and Heideggerian common sense, which, for reasons I'm trying to explain here, fit more naturally with the predilections of American professional aspirations. There are 2 theses in this regard. 1, the philosophical point of departure here is based on the radical exclusion of entire schools of thought, which are simply written out of the record as a solemn act of ideological purification. Number 2, The edginess of the performance, its vivid being at odds with itself, has to do with the ingrained anti-Marxism, which has become the price of admission in dignified theoretical debate in a conservative, upwardly mobile professional setting marked by anti-communism and by internalizing establishment wisdom. A doctrine put forward by conservative media celebrities like David Brooks or State Department intellectuals like Francis Fukuyama is in fact widely accepted by the academic left, namely that the fall of the Soviet Union amounted to proof of the failure of the socialist project. Many of the post-Marxisms since 1989, including the new materialism, derive from this acceptance. The fact is not necessarily applauded, as it is among the conservatives like Bruno Latour, to take only one highly regarded theorist of late, whose dismissals of socialism and antipathy to non-European peoples goes completely uncriticized or even remarked upon by his acolytes. But it is accepted that we have reached the end of history, that capitalism is the only possible system, that Marxism is defeated, and that none of the practical initiatives, organizational discoveries, progressive programs, anti-imperial projects unleashed by the Russian Revolution and the Third World liberation movements of the 20th century are worth anything at all. The entirety of that tradition in this way of thinking must simply be swept aside, according to this flawed thinking, and forgotten, offering us no leads, no uncompleted undertakings, no proof of socialist durability, no insights into the cruelty and pathology that capitalism more and more clearly represents for all of us. This is the framework within which we find ourselves as we struggle to get a handle on the philosophical past, to make distinctions among its various traditions, and to grasp the stakes of its conflicting positions, which makes it a vital political goal today, and one that, apart from being fatally lacking for the most part, also conforms more readily to the peculiar strengths of the humanities. For the humanities tend rather, out of an uncertainty about their own worth, to rush to more immediate relevance in a metaphorical approximation of economics, physics, cognitive psychology, and so on. Widely ridiculed for being pointless, including by critics who are perceived as Marxist, such as Frederick Jameson. The work I'm involved in here of identifying what authors are getting from others, influence tracing, in short, has a very important methodological outcome. It is often characterized as a kind of pointless scholasticism and a cheap exercise, as though finding who took what from whom somehow undermines the originality of the borrower so exposed. But this misses a fundamental point. Influence tracing betrays whom one is thinking through and whom one is not. It positions one within an environment of associations, including their historical residues and teleological aims that have become with the passage of time obscure, although not unimportant. What would a contemporary criticism of labor, neoliberalism, racism, imperial war, the destruction of women, the art-science dichotomy, and so on, look like if our language, attitude, vocabulary, and structures of thought derived from a different constellation than the one it now does? So the expansive, tolerant, forgiving, encyclopedic, satirical impulses of a Rabelais, rather than the brilliant, closed, ironic hopelessness of Cervantes. A Cola de Rienzi rather than a Giordano Bruno, a Paul Masson rather than a Roman Jakobson. We need air to breathe and models to follow, but wallow in many of the same troughs, expressively speaking, whatever our positions. What if we could invent a new mixed style by appealing to a different history of style and execution found in thinkers who are not unknown, but simply not seen as belonging together? There's a populism of letters whose humanistic breath cuts across the usual canonical patterns, just as they revalue the usual avant-gardist challenges to that canon. So there are a few methodological issues that might distinguish my approach for others, in which I take to reflect the methodologies of Marxism as a whole. Number one, it is historical. It flees presentism. It understands current novelties as variations on a past with which they are continuous and reflective less of the individual innovation of the theorist and stronger, often inexorable, structural pressures and agendas. Number two, it is based on an immanent criticism, which is to say that it does not establish prior principles from which to conduct its argument, some pre-existing ethical or ideological principle, but develops its argument out of the logic of the material it is considering, taking it on its own terms, being fair to it in that sense, and disagreeing in a way that pays respect to the intended ends of their interlocutors. Number three, it is dialectical in multiple ways, in the sense first that it seeks truth via negation, the constant moving beyond a present inadequate truth, but also by being skeptical towards established authorities, saying no to received wisdom by remaining critical of that silencing mechanism used when people who want you to shut up tell you scornfully to get real. But it is also dialectical in the sense that, unlike the materialism of the sciences, it brings quality and quantity into tension rather than settling for quantities alone. And also in the original sense of the term dialectic, which refers to dialogue. Most Marxist philosophers do not, as philosophers like Kant, Kierkegaard, or Nietzsche do, announce their truths from on high as apothegms or disembodied declarations. Instead, they engage others. They address their interlocutors. They show what they believe by situating their ideas within a context of rival interests. Even if they disagree, they neither ignore, outmaneuver, or haughtily dismiss their opponents, but engage with them, bringing to the surface the points that separate them. In this spirit, their engagements often have about them a polemical edge, which we find here fully in evidence in the humorous, even at times sarcastic tone of Marx, Feuerbach, Adorno, and Zizek. Now, with regard to our readings, what can we conclude from these observations in an overall sense? The new materialism, and Heideggerian thinking in general, perceives a reality that vibrates, that comes alive for us, reveals to us its extra-human status and its own modes of being, making us aware of human marginality in the larger plenitude of existence. In the dialectical traditions of Marxism, though, the idea seems to me more interesting and certainly less theological. They argue that reality lags behind its own possibilities, that the empirical stuff before us, to be perfectly accurate, is really a lie, since it is in flux and is being altered constantly by our work upon it, as well as by the work of other things. Reality, then, is not only what it is in that moment, but what it potentially could be. Reality can be said in this sense to be brought to reason, and that this, rather than a mere existential opening up of ourselves to experience, is what reality is. Second, that as Feuerbach implies, the claim that humans are only animals controlled by life instincts is to arrogate to humans a special human status, the unique ability to demote their own species. What other species, apart from the human, would do so, and then call this virtue? Since materialist at its most elemental is a term today that until recently was used to refer to Marxists as a euphemism, we might say that the new materialism has a parasitic relationship to it, benefiting too cheaply from the association as their momentum is headed in the opposite direction. The word materialist today proliferates suspiciously during a period of fleeting prospects, disorientation, and a de-emphasis on organization in favor of autonomous evolutionary change, and the replacement of projects and conspiracies with theorizations. The creation of a space within which thought retreats from its actualization and in which the characterization of politics passes for politics. That a concept that until recently, if one actually reads this tradition, which cannot be assumed, implied an intervention based on historical situatedness, a realism grounded in an awareness of temporal movement, fluctuation, and productive tension between change and determination, has now become a polemical weapon against agency and a deliberate rejection of the idea of becoming, contradiction, and dialectical thought in favor of pure immanence, where inactivity is the primary experience, and where what exists is beheld as a revelatory object of ethical restraint, aesthetic beauty, and a contemptuous check on Promethean man. The word materialism and its attendant concepts is a form of signifying, an appropriation of an older tradition that it seeks to cancel out by swarming its registers with a language and a sensibility that turns it against itself. Roger Schenck, a computer scientist and psychologist, is right when he points out that there's no such thing as artificial intelligence, only human intelligence that has been recorded, compartmentalized, manipulated, managed, recorded, and rearranged. Artificial intelligence, to this degree, we might say, is the logical reductio ad absurdum of the alienation of labor, which Schenck delightfully debunks by saying, there really is no need to create artificial humans. We have enough real ones already. My point here is that however much the natural sciences are invoked to establish an objectivity that precludes an active subjectivity, this romance with oblivion already exists in the philosophical traditions of Nietzsche and Heidegger. Let me close this section with the following words taken from Georges Bataille, which were written in the 1950s, Bataille being a thinker from whom Foucault took many of his ideas without acknowledgement. This passage is found in the third volume of his celebrated book, The Accursed Share. Quote, I'm talking about the discourse in which thought, taken to the limit of thought, requires the sacrifice or death of thought. Let us imagine a deserted beach. I can include myself at will, subjectively, in this immensity. I can do so, myself being nothing. It is neither it nor myself being objectified. The immensity becomes something of which I speak, something that speaks to me. I've recognized my equality with the boundlessness, for I know that at bottom I am this subjective and contentless existence, but memory ties me to objects, to contents, in the midst of which I situate myself, one object among the others. End quote. So we see that the new in the new materialism is called into question. On the contrary, the gestures are well established, and moreover, they are associated with familiar themes taken from the European political right. So that concludes my first segment.
Okay, what we'll do is sort of open this up now to questions. And the plan is that I will read out the questions and Professor Brennan will respond to them. So please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions. So we'll just give you some time to get this in.
Sure how it's going to work with the question and answers. Can you just see them out?
Okay. Okay, this is a question from Amelia Reggie, and she asks, can you elaborate more on how Marx, Feuerbach, etc., create a dialogue when compared with other philosophers? Could you point to an example of this dialectical approach?
Yes, what I'm referring to, it's really notable. Whenever there is a poll, for example, that tries to discuss who's the great philosopher of the 20th century, I noticed that it's almost never the case that Adorno is chosen, although he would certainly be my first pick. So it would be people like Heidegger, or it would be Wittgenstein, or it would be Derrida. And what I notice immediately here, and it to me is characteristic of Marxism, is that, Gramsci used to say that he can't begin to think without an interlocutor. It's either an actual interlocutor or it's an imagined one. So his whole process of being able to formulate his ideas is premised on a dialogue, an engagement with somebody else. So if anybody is actually, taking the trouble to read his prison notebooks, you'll notice that so much of what he's writing there are responses to the statements of individuals, often very obscure individuals, in the journals and newspapers and books of his time. The same thing's true of Adorno. I mean, I guess you could say there are summary statements in Adorno. He does write a book like Negative Dialectics, and he does write a book like Aesthetic Theory. But for the most part, his books are responses to other people. Even Negative Dialectics is really an engagement with Heidegger, and he makes that very, very clear. The earlier writings on the Heideggerians of the 1950s, The Jargon of Authenticity, would be a book like this. He writes a book on Kierkegaard. So there's a kind of modesty, I would say, in the Marxist tradition that is very often also a kind of debt paid, or a respect paid to one's opponents. So, if you've read enough Nietzsche, you know that Nietzsche's whole notion of how to conduct an argument is very different. He wants to kind of outmaneuver you. He wants to never grant you the right to disagree with him. He wants to just ignore you and then create, his own pole of attraction. He wants an allure to be created that bypasses his opponents. His opponents are very much on his mind, but he figures the best way to deal with them is not to grant them the respect of an actual engagement. So what is often the case, and I think is fully evident in the readings that I had you all do in the writings of Feuerbach and of Adorno and Marx and Zizek, is that in each case, they are driven to a kind of polemical response to a very, very specific and determinate political issue that has come up in the readings of a certain philosopher. So this can often be used against Marxism, and frequently is. It is a turnoff to many people that say, oh, the Marxists are always making fun of people, and they're polemically dismissing those with whom they disagree. And I'm suggesting here's something else. I'm saying it's dialogic. It's actually more respectful of one's, it's taking responsibility more for your own positions. You're saying, I'm actually according you the respect of having prompted me to respond to you, because I think that what you're saying is really, really important, even though I disagree with it. So I'm not sure if that really gets at what you're saying, but the evident engagements with names named and books mentioned in each one of these readings that I had you do is, to me, very characteristic of one of the methodologies of Marxism, which is based on a kind of humility, a kind of sense of fair play, and a kind of bringing up to the surface one's differences so that they can be debated and decided upon.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. And this is from Sasha McDowell. You mentioned the supremacy of natural sciences in new materialism and within capitalist society. So I was wondering how you reconcile the study of literature and humanities in an era and a society that considers them to be useless.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is the consensus among opinion makers in the media or government that reading literature is useless. I think that certainly is the belief among a fair number of them, but I think that there's rather the view that it's tragic what has happened within the humanities, that it's gotten involved in abstruse theorizing, and that it coats its writings in various jargons that cut off its function from the past. of being the interpreters of the great tradition and the passing along to the next generation of the joys and fulfillment that can come from the reading of the great classics. I think it's something more along those lines. There's a number of ways of dealing with this. I mean, I'm teaching a course right now called Science and Scientism and the Humanities, and which takes up very much this conflict from a number of different angles between the sciences and the humanities, that it's both as it's perceived within the general culture, and I don't think it's that rather controversial that most people who are opinion formers or policymakers consider the work being done in the natural and physical sciences to be more beneficial and more useful, and certainly more certain in its relationship to nature and the truth than what goes on in the humanities, which undoubtedly appears rather aimless to them. The other side of that, though, is that it's very clear that the humanities are taken very seriously, and that what they're really talking about, without wanting to say so, is the ability of humanists within the university to offer an elegant and accessible critical account of what's happening that is wrong in our society, that kind of in the traditions of, a Zizek, or the unfortunately now late David Graeber, or a Zizek, or other public intellectuals who clearly fit this pattern. Humanists have been rather successful as public intellectuals precisely because they're drawing on a generalist knowledge, an interdisciplinary sensibility, a knowledge of literature and the arts, and the life of the spirit, not to be too grandiose, but that sort of thing, rather than from a perspective of narrow investigations in, subatomic particles, or the specialist kind of work that's being done in certain kinds of computer science. So I think that there's a fear of the humanities, not only a dismissal, they kind of go hand in hand. So it shows what the power of the humanities might be. So I think that that's one way of answering your question. Another way, of course, would be, to me, it's the road untraveled, and it's one that I would like to promote a little bit more, which is to show historically how the moment in the past when the humanities and the sciences were not separated, when they were very much a part of the same activity. It's a wonderful recent book written on this by Levitin. But to show that in a very fundamental way, some of the methodologies of the humanities are more scientific than the sciences. And so one can draw here on the wonderful work of people like, well, everybody knows Thomas Kuhn, but the people in his wake like Imre Lakatos and Ian Hacking and Paul Feyerabend and others, who have really shown that the practices of the natural sciences have many of the earmarks and characteristics of what we associate with the humanities. So I think there's a number of ways in which the humanists can show they have, they're hurting power, that power fears them because of their ability successfully to critique in the public sphere, but also that there are certain more epistemological questions that show the humanities to be methodologically closer to the hope of arriving at the truth than the sciences are, precisely because they are a form of generalist rather than specialist knowledge.
Okay, we have a couple of more questions, and so it's 3 more lined up. I hope we can get through them. The next one is from Alexis Webb, and her question is, to the topic of historical context and its importance, who decided that these philosophers and their theories, Heidegger, Marx, etc., would be successful and accepted? Was their success dependent on other philosophers or based on impact? So other philosophers, in parentheses, as the educated, or based on impact as the people? So a broader public.
Wow. Okay, there's 2 things. I mean, one is my estimation for well or ill, for accuracy or inaccuracy, that indeed there are these lineages of influence, right? So one might contest the kinds of genealogy that I've laid out here. However, in this operation that I'm involved in, I'm trying to assess what I think is fairly uncontroversial about who has been influential and who hasn't. The very separate question, the very different kind of question that I think is implicit in yours would be, why was it these and not others who were successful? I think this is precisely the issue that Edward Said was trying to explore in his early book Beginnings. You know, how is it that certain intellectuals in certain situations acquire what he called mass density and referential power? You know, how do they achieve that exactly? And that's a much more difficult question to answer. So the way I'll answer it here, and it won't be sufficient, will be to say that along the lines of the reading that I gave you by both Adorno and Marx, in this case, those two among the four I gave you, the argument is that certain ideas are only possible in certain situations, and that certain historical moments demand a certain array of interests be articulated and represented. And so the philosophers looking back now, ex post facto, who acquired this mass density and referential power, I'm arguing Nietzsche and Heidegger for those traditions of philosophy that have become the dogmatic center of American theory in the humanities, rather than Adorno, Bloch, and Gramsci, let's say, within the left Hegelian tradition, are those who were able to give voice to a felt need among those in institutional positions of power who recognized their own interests in their articulations. That's what's happening here. So it seems to me that there is, well, just to cut to the chase, that, you know, to put it very crudely, and I do admit that this is crude, I'm just trying to kind of make a point here, heuristically, that given the enormous challenge facing intellectuals on the left after the success of the Russian Revolution, and given the enormous popularity of Marxism in the interwar years, there was a huge fear among more conservative thinkers about this sweeping the territory and becoming the dominant. And it required a philosopher like Heidegger to come and, because he wasn't able to defeat their arguments or show the historical irrelevance of what was clearly not, to outmaneuver it, to short circuit it, to change the discussion. And I think that this is what's going on here. It's a very clever patchwork composition that he's involved in, because he's involved in something that's deeply metaphysical and quasi-religious, right? A kind of invocation of the ineffable and the conundrum, right? The kind of delight in irresolution. But he's doing it in a language that connotes, that points to physicality, the material universe, existence, day-to-day life, right? And it's that combination which he artfully concocts that made it so compelling to those who wanted an alternative to Marxism in the interwar years when it was threatening to become the dominant.
Okay, what I might do is just read out both questions and see if we can sort of move through them. This is from Daniel Gonzalez. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. The audience of the unit is dispersed across different disciplines, and some people would disagree that Marxism has been wholly dismissed in their disciplines. Do you think that this turn to new materialism and disregard for Marxist materialism is particular to literary studies? And if so, why?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. And it allows me to clarify a few things. I'm not saying that Marxism has been completely marginalized. If anything, I would say the turn away from the post-structuralist heyday of discourse theory and deconstruction of the 80s and 90s has led to a highly radical verbiage among humanist theorists who are frequently invoking Marx and highlighting Marx's thought and its centrality. This wouldn't necessarily be Marxist thinking that is being represented by this, but I think the gestures are certainly there, and one could argue that. I'm very well aware of the prestige of Marxism in the disciplines of political science, sociology, and other places, particularly at certain schools. So like SOAS, for example, which, I think you can't even be like, invited onto the faculty if you're not some sort of Marxist. So, I'm completely on board with that way of thinking. What I am saying is that I'm addressing myself to the theory context of the humanities within the United States. And I'm trying to say that regardless of the verbal gestures to Marxism that frequently can be found even there, that there is a deep anti-communist common sense that has been internalized within the liberal academy, if I could put it that way, and that this has led to certain preferences rather than others within theoretical traditions. Primarily, as I tried to say in my talk, let me just repeat these 2 points, that that it's motivated in part by the acceptance of the proclamation by Fukuyama that Marxism is dead and that capitalism is the only possible future for us all, and so we have to carve out some sort of space within that accepted situation, and also by the very inaccurate judgment that post-structuralism has won the argument, that the arguments of Foucault and Lyotard and Kristeva and others, that this argument has displaced Marxism and made us see the fatal inadequacies of Marxism as a way of thinking, and so that any Marxism that we could possibly enjoy today would have to be a post-Marxism of some variety, right? Like a biopolitical one or a Negriite one, or there's many other options. And I'm trying to be more classical than that. I'm trying to hold out for something that really is a direct continuity with the past. Now, why was it in the humanities? Well, I mean, why was it primarily within literature that these sorts of things are happening? The fact of the matter is that the phenomenon of theory within the university is the invention of literature departments. It has the virtue of priority, I would say. I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but I think that when you look at it historically, given the disciplinary indefiniteness of literature departments and the crisis of the decline of the new criticism, and the sense of the kind of brainless pragmatism that existed in literature departments as late as the mid-1960s, that it was a vehicle for continental thinkers to find a springboard within the literature departments, partly because the philosophy departments were closed to them, having gone over completely to analytic philosophy. So the only way that philosophy, as was traditionally done, could survive is to do so through English departments. This gave a fertile, terrain for these forms of thought, which is why I think literature departments have produced this way of thinking more prominently.
One last question. When you refer to the historical element of the materialist left Hegelian tradition, can you elaborate more on what distinguishes this from the perhaps more Heideggerian historicity in post-structuralist thought?
I think that what one finds in a thinker like Derrida, for example, is the notion of a language that speaks man, to take one of the Heideggerian notions that he took up and developed in his own unique ways. So you get the sense of a kind of a receding referent and a constant ludic nature of language continually escaping the grasp of signification, right? So this has the effect of eliminating the importance of determining what an author might have intended It undermines the notion of communicability and articulation, and it displaces the author from his or her own work in a way that creates the notion of the death of the subject. When you read the situated historical works of Foucault, who's not a Heideggerian thinker, I would say, much more of a Nietzschean thinker, but nevertheless, it would be a useful analogy. What strikes one very first about that way of doing history, let's say in Discipline and Punish, is that there are no agents, there are no actors, and there's no causation. Things develop, they unfold. It's passive and evolutionary. It's structural. Epistemic shifts occur. It's not as though some individual at some point in time took ideas from somebody else and created a movement. You don't get that sense. In fact, it's very carefully deleted from the account of history. Similarly with Heidegger himself, when you read him, I don't know exactly what you're referring to when you talk about the historicity found in Heidegger. That's a very complex topic that I can't get into sufficiently here, partly because of the peculiarities of the Heideggerian lexicon, which are constantly involved in what Bourdieu calls a louche maneuver, right? It's kind of, if you know Spanish, it's like chuecos. It's like heading off in helter-skelter in order to not be pinned down, right? So it's a deliberate ambiguity that he uses with terms like thing or metaphysics or historicity. But what you do, what's unmistakable in this way of thinking is the thought that the individual perceptive being in the world, Dasein, reflecting on their own existence, doesn't discover the truth of the world that surrounds them. It is revealed to them, right? It's a passive procedure. So in all of these very different ways, there's a commonality, which is the obliteration of the subject, the oblivion of the subject. And this is the desired end, the telos, I would say, for thinking that likes to describe itself as non-teleological. It's very teleological. This is exactly what it is always attempting to do. You contrast that to the notion of history in Marx in the reading, for example, that you were given. I mean, he's trying to say that to understand yourself, you can't do so without looking at what you grew out of. And to understand who you are, you have to look at what you've made. And partly what you've made is your own physical environment. Partly what you've made is the group that you happen to occupy and that you are constantly exchanging ideas with and who are affecting you, right? This is what a materialist history is for a Marxist. It's about the activity of the individual agent of history making their surroundings and learning by doing.
Okay, thank you. We have about another half an hour left.
So I won't go for a full 25 minutes. Let me just say things for 15 or something, and then is that okay? Can we come back then? Okay. Well, I was going to return to Feuerbach here and try to maybe do what I didn't do in the first, what I didn't want to do in the very first part of the talk, which is to direct us back a little bit more towards the readings and what the readings told us. But I do want to say that what I tried to establish by giving you these particular readings was itself a continuity, since I have been hammering away at this notion that the revolutionary break implied by the phrase new materialism is actually not a break, that it is coming out of earlier, very recognizable and similar philosophical moments upon which it is drawing without acknowledgement. But the idea was to show that what is going on in Feuerbach, who we always hear invoked, we always hear about Marx's theses on Feuerbach, but very few people take, the trouble to go read Feuerbach himself, is that many of the things that are attributed to Marxist thinking, like, for example, the notion of the alienation of labor, right, can be found fully formed in Feuerbach himself. That there's a relationship that is similar, as Feuerbach paints it, between the well-known argument in Marxism that the worker in the act of laboring for a wage is estranged from their own labor power, which, because it enriches the capitalist, then makes the capitalist more powerful, which means that their own labor is now used against them. It arises up as an alien force to oppress them. And that is, made analogous, as Feuerbach presents it, to a point about secularity in religion, that what happens in all religion in one way or another is the ascription of human activity and essence and power to a power outside of it, and out of fear and ignorance, as Feuerbach puts it, transported to another world. So I'm trying to show that there are these steps that sort of one can trace in these readings, however crudely, from Feuerbach through Marx to Adorno to Zizek, and that this is representative in the ways that I pointed out in my study questions of some of the essential ideas of the left Hegelian tradition. So my points were, as you recall, that there is the necessity for Marxists is to critique religious thought, not necessarily religion, because religious thought can be found also within philosophy. And this would be to undermine the notions of the alienation that arises from religious thought and the notion of the ineffable. That there is a protest against intellectual pretenses, that phrases rather than actions are what are favored in a certain kind of ultra-left academic pretentiousness. So this is something that really links all of the readings, I think, in one way or another. That an aesthetic register is often what is wielded in philosophy to create a pole of attraction, right? That beautiful words stand in for rationalism, which is considered in this way of thinking unnecessary. And that part of the attempt to demote or undermine critical thought is to do so on the grounds that it is too negative, right? Too negative. It's too polemical and too negative. And therefore, there's an abreaction to the polemicism that one often associates with Marxism, which is what I spent some time in the question and answer period trying to elucidate, because it's a misunderstanding, it seems to me. So again, the primary points of the readings had to do with the fact that the materialism that is at issue within Marxism is a materialism based on human conceptualization and human activity, including the activity that creates our own surroundings. And what is evident about the materialism and the new materialism is an inert objectivity of things and objects, and the logical extension of that to say that human beings themselves are among those indifferent objects of nature. So there is, at this point, probably some use in looking at the new materialist quotations that I gave you. And I'd like to just look at them with you now. I hope you have these in front of you, because I was hoping that you would. The first quotation has to do with, you notice that this is from the Diana Kuhl and Samantha Frost introduction to this anthology called The New Materialism. You notice how in their wording there, they're emphasizing creative affirmation rather than being critical or negative. And that although they're very interested in talking about invention, they ascribe invention to materiality itself rather than to the subject. They want very much, and admit that they want, that the post-humanism that grows out of the new materialism wants very much to put a limit on humans, as they put it, agentic efficacy. And they do this in favor of the vibrant, constitutive, and aleatory. So you can see that there is some sleight of hand that's involved in these thinking that I was hoping would become more evident after the readings that I shared with you, that there is an allure that's created clearly by talking about things like the vibrant. And who would not, favor on the face of it something that is creatively affirming and therefore upbeat over something that's negative? But of course, the negative that's really being referred to here, and this is not what's being talked about in this introduction, it is not a naysaying, right? It's not the desire to simply contradict someone with whom you disagree. It's the attempt to take on and internalize the truth value or the truth content of that with which you disagree, but to push it further in a different direction, right? So the progress of thought in Hegelian thinking is referred to him as negation. And it's something that finds its way in even non-Marxist thinking that I think one would more easily applaud in the work, for example, of Edward Said, who is constantly trying to say, look, the real business of humanists is to be advocates of the humanities. And the real business of humanists is to say no, is to be skeptical, to question authority, to find out for yourself rather than to join something else. It's certainly not to abandon one's sense of activity in the world in pursuit of, the aleatory, chance. So I think it would take too much time to go through each one of these. So let me do something else instead. I think that what is lingering behind the discussion that we've had so far is the idea of humanism itself. And let me say a word or two about what is implied by the new materialism in respect of humanism, which I take to be, rightly so, the philosophical outlook of those who are involved in the humanities, or it should be, right? It seems to me that post-humanism is involved in a performative contradiction, right? It affirms the vitality or creative power of bodies and forces in order to cut against the hubris of human exceptionalism. I'm quoting Jane Bennett from Vibrant Matter there, right? To this end, she tries to argue that it's things that possess creative force, whereas humans are merely among those undifferentiated things. But what she doesn't really draw our attention to is that it is Bennett who is involved in theorizing her own non-exceptual materiality and not those things, at least as far as we know. She alludes frequently to Deleuze, who, speaking once about his own excretory processes, wrote, with apparent modesty, that my writing is one flow among others, with no special place in relation to others. But again, we know about his other flows, sperm and shit and so on, from his writing, and not his writing from his other flows. So it all kind of leads to this particular desire, I would say, right? Because it really is about a telos. It's about wanting very much to achieve the oblivion of the human rather than to be forced to concede it in an age of biotechnology and artificial intelligence. So, Bruno Latour, for example, sets out on the basis of reading Alan Turing to posit that since computers have become capable of solving tasks of which humans are individually incapable, that they themselves have become subjects divorced from their human interlocutors. possessing an independent culture, and no longer dependent on the humans who built them, program them, or interpret their findings. So these kinds of this kind of thinking, which is really prevalent in lots of, from Nature magazine to the science section of the New York Times, is one that's very much internalized and taken on, positively so, by many of the thinkers within the new materialism. But the performative contradiction of such a statement seems to escape them, that until computer programs, until computers program humans, grow their own hardware, or contest their programmers' instructions, nothing like independence can be claimed for them, obviously. So I think that there is a project behind humanism that we have to understand the outcome of. We have to question a little bit what lies behind the effort to derealize human subjectivity and to turn the human into an object, or to draw the conclusions, as I read recently in a kind of interesting article on Robinson Jeffers, the American poet, in Harper's Magazine, where the author says that he would just as soon kill a human as a hawk, and that if the entire human race were wiped out, along with their architecture and their works of art, it wouldn't bother him at all. So there is this feeling of a kind of green misanthropy, which, one at a certain level, if they're not involved in a way of thinking that says that, it's not humanity as a whole that's creating this destruction, but certain classes of human beings with certain interests. And if you don't believe in progressive change, I guess there's a certain logic to wanting to, wipe humans off the face of the earth. After all, I mean, this has only produced this horrible society that we've lived in. So, why not? But it's a form of thinking that is giving up much more than it says it's giving up, right? I mean, we think of humanism as being, the image of slaveholders, lecturing slaves on, the virtues of reason, right? That kind of imagery. But really what we're talking about is, the maverick secularity of Thales and Anaxagoras, the philological study of Roman law in Varro, the preservation of Oriental learning in the Islamic Golden Age of Averroes and Avicenna. We're talking about the first universities, the madrasas of the Maghreb and the Levant, the humanism of the French Revolution. We're talking about Feuerbach and Marx. So what are we giving up, actually? Plus, so many of the people that wouldn't be so easily dismissed in this discourse. George McDeasy, for example, who writes on the Arabic contributions to humanism. Iqbal Ahmed, who does the same. Aimé Césaire in his notebook on a return to his native land. All of them are partisans of humanism. John Dewey's pragmatism, which took shape as an effort to reverse the nativism and racial panic of early 20th century anti-immigration movements, right, was defiantly humanist. The Brahmo Samaj of Tagore and others in West Bengal. M.N. Roy, the co-founder of the Mexican Communist Party and a Bengali revolutionary, right, spent the final decades of his life building a movement tied to an institute at Dehradun on behalf of what he called a cultural educational organization founded with the object of re-educating the educators and young intellectuals of India in spirit and with the ideas of radical integral humanism. So it seems to me that the anti-humanist undercurrents of the new materialism, against which I think Marxism offers a cogent reply and a different set of options, is politically vexed. To join the forces of such anti-humanism is to reject much more than hypocritical Eurocentric philosophies of progress or imperious universals molded in the image of Western males. It is rather to assault a centuries-long heritage of resistance and renovation, of which Marxism is the inheritor and a decisive modern representative. Okay, so we can go to question and answer now.
Okay, we have some time now for your questions. This question is from Iman Kanem, and she asks, my apologies that this question does not directly address the readings, but I'm interested to know how, if at all, your work on Marx and Marxists influenced your work on Edward Said and post-colonial theory, or vice versa. By way of speaking about your own intellectual process, how do you consolidate the different areas of your theoretical work?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a kind of a difficult one to answer because there's so much to talk about. I said at the beginning that I've never called myself a Marxist, although I suppose other people would have a different opinion about that. To me, it's, you know, I follow the readings of different philosophical schools and draw the conclusions that I think best fit the historical record and the logical consistency of the positions given, and the vision of the future that is potential within the philosophies, and arrive at certain conclusions. So many of those thinkers, not all by any means, are in fact Marxists, but there are many who are not, like David Graeber or Noam Chomsky or Pierre Bourdieu or a number of other thinkers that I could mention. I have a very specific answer to your question about the dovetailing of you know, Marxist thinkers in my own writing that I happen to write about. I guess two of them would be C.L.R. James, I've done a lot of writing about, and M.A. Césaire, the Cuban intellectual and author of Music in Cuba. I mean, so these would be two people that I've spent a lot of time like researching and digging up original things about. So I think, what? So I think that the issue about the relationship to post-colonial studies is a very clear one. I was dismayed to see the way that post-colonial studies came on the scene in the United States and Britain in a way that had to do with the suppression of the earlier movements of anti-colonial thought and action that were, I think, actively suppressed. As you might or might not know from some of my writing, I've sometimes described this as the Big Bang theory of anti-colonial you know, epistemologies, as though post-colonial studies was posing itself as the very first group of people here in the 1980s and 90s to amount to systematic critique of you know, European value, and to open the doors for the first time to non-Western thinkers, and to place people of color from former colonial states in positions of authority within the metropolis, and so on and so forth. And I find this to be terrifically untrue. I think that it's much more the case that the big breakthrough that took place in anti-colonial thinking took place in you know, the early parts of the 20th century with the effects of the Mexican Revolution on European thinking, and then the Russian Revolution, which was this revolution on the periphery of Europe that offered a platform to people operating at a level of equality from all the colonies of the world in a single unified organizational structure. It was absolutely mind-blowing what this did and how it changed the way that people thought. I think somebody just gave me a note saying that I made the mistake of saying M.A. Césaire was the editor, the author of Music in Cuba. I meant Alejo Carpentier. I thought that's what I said. Anyway, so I think that there is a huge amount to applaud in post-colonial studies. I'm considered a part of post-colonial studies. That's the aegis under which I was hired and made my career. And therefore, it's opening up of the canon, and it's creating openings for intellectuals from India, Latin America, Asia, and so on in the Western Academy is entirely salutary. But it didn't operate in a vacuum. It did take place very much within, an American cultural scene that was characterized by professionalization, by the age of Reagan and the conservative turn of the general culture, and by an anti-communist common sense, which moved it to completely neglect the forerunners and predecessors, like some of the revolutionaries involved in the Third International that was prompted by the Russian Revolution, and by the Third World liberation intellectuals of the post-war period, Aimé Césaire and Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon and others. And also, the kind of work that was going on in epistemology and in sociology and economics by, Emmanuel Wallerstein and Samir Amin and others. So it seems to me it's a much more complicated and gloriously stratified and varied contribution to anti-colonial thought than we really get the picture of in the story that post-colonial studies wants to tell. In regard to Said, I mean, clearly, Said is somebody I knew really, really well and was with him as the rise of post-colonial studies was happening. And so I've got very specific opinions about that. Said was not himself a Marxist, but he often acted as their attorneys, if I could put it that way. He was constantly against anti-Marxists and would rail against them, and was constantly showing how much he had learned from the Marxist intellectuals he read. And he didn't ever openly disavow post-colonial studies, but it's very clear that he had a testy, at times antagonistic relationship to it, that given the fact that there were a certain theoretical environment, obtained when post-colonial studies came into being, which was largely post-structuralist. And given the fact that Said was largely departing from post-structuralism in the late 1970s, and definitively did so, I think, in his writing on the American Academy, found in his collected essays or selected essays from The World, the Text, and the Critic, he had a rather uneasy relationship with this field that he was often said to have founded. So I think that there's deeply Marxist strains in Said's thought, but he's not a Marxist, and yet he's even less of a post-colonialist, if I could put it that way.
Two more questions. This one is from Dustin Bacon, and he says, Adorno seemed rather dismissive of Buddhism, particularly in negative dialectics. Did I read that correctly? And more importantly, what responsibility do Western theorists bear to engage seriously with non-Western thought when considering the nature of human subjectivity?
Well, they have a huge obligation to do so, and many of the finest of them do. I'm not remembering right off the possibly dismissive remarks of Adorno towards Buddhism. I wouldn't be surprised. I think that he is a very, he's a Mandarin, and he is deeply Eurocentric. What I know, of course, is because I've written a book about it and translated Alejo Carpentier's Music in Cuba, I know a lot about that aspect of things. And so Adorno's infamous remarks on jazz, which many people have tried to explain away, are the clearest to me. And so I've even written about this blind spot in his part. He can't see that there's any innovation within Afro-Latin music that wasn't first, created in European waltzes, in the 19th century. So there are those blind spots. I don't think that negates Adorno's enormous contribution to our thinking and his progressive thinking overall. The thinkers that I would more readily turn to would be somebody like Raymond Williams in the Country and the City, way before there was the Post-Colonial Studies. He was writing about the perfect analogous relationship between the country and the city, a relationship of metropolis to periphery that occurred internally within England. And he explicitly compares that to the world empires that Europe, and especially England, presided over. And he calls on intellectuals like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and others in the pages of this book. This was published in 1972. Nobody was writing about this in English studies that I'm aware of, or very few anyway. There is, you know, it's a debate. It's a mixed program. I mean, you can find the work of Ernst Bloch very interesting in this respect. There's constant references to non-Western sources of philosophy in his Principle of Hope. Some of them seem more developed than others, but you know, here's a guy who wrote a book on Avicenna and you know, the left traditions of philosophy emanating from the Muslim Middle East. So I think that there is, in books like those that I did include on my bibliography, I hope that you got that, that are more recent within the Marxist tradition, that highlight what Marx himself, what his orientation was towards the non-Western world, and what intellectual resources could be found outside of Europe that are given full attention and developed as ways of thinking. So it's a long and complicated answer that would be required to answer your question adequately, but there's a mountain of material that people have dug up, and I would refer you to some of those books that on the bibliography I gave you, just for want of being able to rehearse them all here.
The next question is from Blair Winter. Marx used the term materialism to counter ideology and consciousness. If we were to talk about historic materialism today, vis-a-vis neoliberalism, do you think historical materialism is still a term to oppose it? Have scholars proposed other terms to actualize Marxist ideas in relation to neoliberalism?
Well, I have no doubt that the last statement is true. It would probably take, you know, weeks to enumerate all the different you know, neologisms or phrases that have been invented along those lines. But let me instead turn to the first part of your question, because I think that there's a confusion that needs to be cleared up. Marx does not counterpose the term materialism to consciousness or ideology. The term materialism, as he understands it, centrally involves consciousness. It is the paradox of historical materialism from the contemporary point of view, or from a scientific point of view, would be that if one is restricting themselves to the study of matter alone, they are not a materialist from Marx's perspective. Everything that human beings can possibly know about nature, everything that is the reality of nature to them, can only be conceptual, right? Now, that means that it relies on consciousness, but it's not the case that every form of consciousness is equal to every other. There's a labor involved in the concept. So I know that Marx poses himself, and very often is posed by others, as being antagonistic to Hegel, but he's antagonistic to Hegel's philosophy in much the way Adorno is. That is, he thoroughly has internalized Hegelian modes of reasoning and thinking and arguing, and tries to distance himself from one respect of Hegel, which is the notion in Marx that our ideas are not formative of the reality that we perceive, but are the results of that reality, the outcome, as it were, of the material limitations and conditions within which we find ourselves, which are partly of our own making. So what Marx thoroughly internalizes is the idea that we don't create the objects of nature, clearly. The world doesn't depend on our thinking about it. But that doesn't really free us up to imagine a relationship to nature that wouldn't involve consciousness. We don't have that option. Our relationship to the world and the formation of concepts is mediated by thought. It can't be otherwise. And then in a separate step, it's mediated by the language that we use to express those concepts. So the idea that Hegel has is that we can actually achieve reality, that we're not continually, we can understand the truth of nature. How? Well, this has to do with his, his use of the terms for itself and in itself. For humans, in the act of conceptualization, the reality of nature can be achieved by an adequation of our concept to the nature that surrounds us. How can we be sure that it's adequate? The point is rather that we are understanding ourselves to be involved in a collective project. Other people are doing the same thing. They're attempting to wrestle with their relationship to the world of nature. The more that human beings understand that they are simultaneously subjects and objects of their interrelationship with other consciousnesses, the more they understand that a collectively shared truth about the reality of nature, albeit conceptual, is real for us, right? So this is, I don't know if that's persuasive to you, and maybe I could explain it a little bit better, but this would be an important, I don't know, sort of revision of the first part of your question. I think that historical materialism is very much a way of approaching and making sense out of the contemporary neoliberal world. I think that in my own way, probably not as successfully as it might have been the case, this whole exercise that I've been involved in here, the writing of my study notes and my giving of this lecture on Marxism that focuses especially on the problem of materialism, has been an effort to show through a methodology of historical materialism how many of the constants and belief systems of neoliberalism are evident in the supposed opposition to neoliberalism found in current post-humanist theories. How did I do that? Well, I tried to show how and why a certain philosophical tradition came about that was more amenable to intellectuals within a particular environment, that of the post-Reaganite United States. And that there were certain telos, certain ends that needed to be accomplished and achieved that made certain philosophers and not others more attractive. I only scratched the surface. There's so many ways in which this can be explained, but in my own way, in a small way, I was trying to apply the principles of historical materialism to give a rationale for why these proliferation of new theories in the humanities, like the new materialism, are coming about at precisely the moment that they seem the least progressive and the least inviting from the point of view of progressive social change. That is, the very moment of global warming, the moment when the Anthropocene has been declared, suddenly we have a spate of philosophies that want to eliminate and obliterate the active subject of history and to see change as being created from without us by nature in an evolutionary fashion. This seems to me, among other things, an enormous abdication of responsibility and a suspicious dovetailing on the part of self-described progressive academics with some of the major thoughts of neoliberalism.
We have 2 more questions. So let me read them both out together, and then perhaps we can bring this to a close. The The first one is from Deb Chatterjee. It's interesting how you brought into account the activities of Brahma Samaj, among others, within a broader defense of humanism. Rabindranath Tagore's Gora, however, portrays a very different picture of the Brahma Samaj, regressive, conservative, and insular. Furthermore, in India, one of the steepest challenges the communist movement faced throughout the 20th century was from several religious outfits that tend to associate with humanist and pan-Hindu ideologies. I would love to hear your views on that. So let me just move to the next question as well, which is from Dat Lu. And it is, in lieu of rapid technological advancements that cannot be articulated in a way that reproduces capitalist production, would you say that the new materialism is a part of a larger trend within liberal academia to mystify the natural sciences in an effort to approximate the natural to the social?
Let me take the latter first. I think that that's very well put and very much in harmony with the kinds of things that I've been saying. I think it's a very succinct comment that I wholly endorse if I understand it fully. I will just reiterate, though, that I don't find the new materialism as a turn or as a gesture wholly reprehensible. I think that there's certainly a lot of reasons to accept the point that underlies it, that the culturalist theory is that everything is a result of social construction and there's no reality outside language, and you know, these kinds of notions that proliferated fairly commonly in the 80s and 90s, that we move beyond that way of thinking. And so this idea, this urge to come back to a rootedness, something that pays full attention to the recent discoveries in the natural sciences, which I wholly endorse. I mean, it's a very new world when biotechnology threatens to efface the very definition of what it means to be a human being, and when venture capitalists are moving away from the zeros and ones of the digital world that they invested so heavily in, and are now going into the makings of DNA in order to create new species and to undermine the notion of what the human being is. These are tremendous challenges, and they are historically new. So to pay attention the way they are to these recent developments in physics and in artificial intelligence and in biotechnology is something I completely endorse. I, of course, draw different conclusions. But I like the fact that they're attempting to overcome culturalism, and this is a good thing. But they, it all comes down to really the major idea, which I've now said a couple of times. I guess I'm just repeating myself, but the notion of Edward Said, I think, says it very, very well. He's on my mind, obviously, because I just finished his biography. But and I just also taught a seminar earlier today where we read his Humanism and Democratic Criticism. The only real historical force that we can rely on to save us from catastrophe is the humanist version of the individual responsible agent of history. It seems that we're giving up way too much if we give that up. And you certainly can't give it up easily on the very thin, very flimsy kind of evidence that is marshaled in the post-humanist theories of Jean Bennett or this anthology or some of the other people, Levi Bryant and Timothy Morton and the others that I quoted. Now, the other issue is, my experience in India, which I go to quite a lot, is that there's any number of thinkers who are from the past, important thinkers, like Swami Vivekananda or Tagore or others, who are taken up and misused by the Hindu right of the BJP. So I think that this is. There is a sense of contradiction, I think, that must be retained when drawing on influences from the past. So you point out, and I think quite rightly in your question, that there are dark sides to this Abramo Samaj movement, which I don't for a moment deny. But what I do think is true is that there was an attempt to, if I could use this without, kind of eviscerating the detail of the movement, that there was a secularization effort involved in that, and certainly an effort to reduce the influence of caste. And so there were these progressive moments in Tagore that I think in that particular movement, as elite as it might have been, that need to be acknowledged and retained. Now, he is not the only one, or that movement is not the only one in that list that I offered of kind of the glorious past of humanism, that would have elements within it that we might find wanting. But I don't think that that's really the issue. It isn't a question of ideological purification. It's a question of which philosophical resources do we draw on in the influences that we always actively seek in order to orient ourselves best for the task that needs to be done. And I think that when you look at it from that point of view, I take my stand with the humanism represented by those traditions that I outlined, and by the particular what the traditions of dialectical materialism, as found in these 4 readings that I gave you, teach in regard to the nature of materialism, seen from the point of view of our humanist work.
Thank you very much, Professor Brennan, and thank you to everyone who has been here for this talk. It's been wonderful having you here, and we've kept you well past your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.